Hello everyone and welcome back to Coding with Tom. In .NET 8, Blazor supports the use of forms in server-side rendering mode. What this means is that you can do basic form functionality on specific pages or components without having to enable interactive server, interactive WebAssembly, or auto rendering modes. This is part of the new philosophy of .NET 8, which says only use these interactive modes when they're necessary. In .NET 7, your Blazor project had to be entirely in interactive server mode with SignalR or WebAssembly. But now you can choose whether to use these techniques on different pages or even different components. And for many forms, it's not necessary to use either of these. So we're going to show how now you can use basic form functionality without using SignalR or WebAssembly. Here's the form I created for this video. It uses a lot of the simple components like radio buttons, checkboxes, drop-downs, text fields, even a date input control. These are all available in the Blazor edit form. Let me show you how it works. If I don't put any data in and hit update, you can see that there's validation occurring. I show the validation errors in a summary at the top, as well as in line with each of the inputs. So if I start filling these out and resubmit, you'll see that the errors go away. So if I pick a size, if I put in a name, last name, and now the email, I allow some extra special validation. If I put in this email address, for example, it's going to say not available to test.com users. So if I change it, it'll work. If I also put in an invalid format of an email, it won't work either. So if I put an email that's not that, then it's going to work. So at this point, the form is submitted successfully and all the values are acceptable. I also have some other validation rules in here. For example, you can't have peppers and sausage at the same time. So I'm going to show you how to do these custom validations in this form. Before I go to the code, let me just reiterate that neither Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly is enabled for this. This is all functioning using server-side rendering. Let's begin up here in the code in the markup. The first thing I have to do is include the system's component model data annotations because we're going to be using that for validation. And I also have a regular expression validator that I use below. So those are these two usings. The edit form is right here. You have to provide a model or edit context. In this case, I'm providing an edit context. You give the form a name. This is important, especially if you have more than one form on the page. An onValid submit will actually call this method once all of the validators have run and there are no errors. That's here, the validating object, data annotations validator. This does the work of validating all of the values. And then this validation summary just displays a list of all of the errors. I could take this out if I don't want to see that validation summary at the top, but for now I'll leave it in. Now if we go down the list here, I have several inputs. The first one is the first name, and I have an input text component. And what this does is it binds the value of the input to an object that has a method or a member called first name. I'm going to go down and actually show you this model object before we continue. So let me scroll down there now and show you. The model I created for this is a pizza order class, and it has properties for all of the different inputs that we're going to use for our form. First one is cooked, which is just a string that saves the value for how you'd like the pizza cooked. 3 booleans for the checkboxes for extra cheese, peppers, and sausage. A size, which is by default null, but will have the values of small, medium, and large. Notice the required annotation. This means you have to specify a size. These data annotations are recognized by the data validator. So if you put annotations in, it will enforce these things. So the next one we have is the first name, and I have two annotations for that. I have a required, and I have a string length. So if the user types a name that's too long, it's going to tell them. Similarly, for last name, it's also required, and a longer string length is allowed. The email is also required, and then there's an email annotation, which I made a custom annotation that I'm going to show you. And then required for delivery time. So they have to choose a delivery time. It defaults to today's date and time. So let me scroll back up to the top and continue the explanation. Okay, so we had the first name. So the first name property is bound to the object's first name property. The input text is bound for the last name to the last name property. Notice also I have under each one a validation message object. So this is where the inline errors will show if the person didn't enter proper data for that particular field. And they work by just having a for argument that has the object property name. And it'll grab the message for that property. Next one is the email with a validation message. Now the next one is a select option, which is a drop-down. There's an input select object in Blazor that you bind to the property that you'd like it to be. Now what I do is you have to list the options that are in the drop-down. So the first thing I do is show options for them having not entered anything yet. And that would be if the model has a null size. So if it's null, then I'm going to show an option in my list that is actually currently selected because they haven't selected a size yet. So I'm going to put an option with a value of nothing in and have it selected. Else, so if there is a size select value in my model object, that means they have picked a size, but I still need to show that default option. I just don't mark it as selected. Then I go through all of the actual options that I have. So I have a list of pizza sizes that have option objects that have a value and a display property that I'm going to use. So what I have to do is I'm going to go through all the pizza sizes. So the pizza sizes are, and I'll show you down below, right here, just options. The value is, for value small, we're going to show small with a capital S. For value medium, we're going to show medium with a capital M, and the same for large. So these are the three options. So if I go back up here and I look at these options, again, I have to put out an option with a selected tag if that is the current pizza size that is selected. So if the size matches the current option we're looking at in the array, then put an option tag out with it selected, where the value is the value and the display will be what the user sees in the dropdown. Now, if it's not currently the one selected, then I just put out a regular option tag with no selected markup. So this is something you have to do to make sure that it properly renders the select every time the page refreshes. You have to do this checking of value matching and putting in option selected. You don't have to do that for the simpler components like just text fields or checkboxes. That works automatically with the data binding, but when it comes to options in a select, you have to do it this way. I hadn't done it this way initially and it wasn't working, so I figured out I had to do this. And of course the validation message for it. Now down here we just have checkboxes and they work fairly easily. You just bind the values to the properties that are Booleans. And then I can show the validation message. So these are all like visually in one location, so I could just show all the errors potentially. And I don't think there are any, but if there were, this is where they would show. Now the next thing I have is a radio button group. And this is a little simpler than the drop-down. I have a set of options for what cooking options we have, and if I go down I'll show you those. We have light, normal, and well done. Different values to what is displayed. So I can use this option array up here and inside the input radio group, actually generate input radio tags with the value and displays set. And then at the bottom here, validation message. And then my last one is this input date component, which just binds to the delivery time property. So let me go down to the validation customization I did for the email. And that's down here. I created another attribute. So this is a email attribute class, which inherits from the validation attribute object, which all of your attributes need to in order for them to work with this validation tool with the edit form. There is a isValid method you have to implement where you receive the context of the validation, but then you also receive the value that the person entered. So we can go through and check this value and see what they entered and decide whether it's good or not. So first of all, if the value is not null, then at least they entered one. So if I go down to the end of this if, you'll see if they didn't want enter an email, I'll say new validation result email is required. And then you have to pass in this array to show the member in the context for this error to actually be bound to the right component property. So we have the value being not null. Here, if the value isn't null, then I go ahead and do a regular expression pattern match on it. This is the pattern I'm using. It's a very simple one. Not completely comprehensive for emails, but it's good enough. If it's a match, then I'll say, then it's good. So if it matches this, I know it's a good email. So else, I can say validation result invalid email format if it didn't match. Now we go in here and do further checking. So I do a simple contains comparison to see if it contains this test.com domain. And if it does contain it, I'll say, sorry, not available to test.com users. Else, so if everything else is good, then I do return validation result dot success. So the way this works is, since this attribute class is called email attribute, up here, this email attribute on the email property recognizes that fact. It's mapped directly. So you see how I have it highlighted, and it can tell down here that this is the matching validation attribute for that property. So that's what's giving us that extra bit of validation just for this email address. So let me just explain a few more things about this page. I'll go here to the oninitialized. What you have to do is create there's a couple objects you have here. So we have our model that I showed you down there. We have to create an instance of the model. And what I do is I create it only if it's hasn't already been created. That's what this notation is. And I create an edit context with that form model in the constructor. I have this second level of validation that is not required at this point. So if I were to take this out, everything as of now will still work that I showed you. But I'm going to show you what that is in a second. And then we create a message store. And what that does is store all of the validation messages. So all the potential errors that occur. So at this point, everything will work. All the validations I put in, and the validations it will process are only these validations based on these attributes. Now, the last thing to mention is that this submit form method is only going to be called after all of the validations have passed. And at that point, the form model object will have valid data. So this is where you would actually process the input of the form. You might create a database record. You might redirect to another page that shows a receipt, and do whatever you would do when the person submits the form. So it's not really important for this lesson to go into all that. But this is where you would start that process, knowing that the data that's come in is good. So if I run this, you would see the functionality that I already had still function. etc. So that line I got rid of doesn't matter down here. What this is, though, let me explain it, is a extra level of validation that you can do on top of the attributes. So after the attributes have all been processed and that validation is completed, you can add more validation methods that'll run in addition to that. So what I did is show the use of that. And there's a reason I'm going to show you why I did this separately. I didn't make an attribute. And this is to compare the checking of the sausage and the peppers. So I could have done an attribute for this, but doing this, you're going to see in the life cycle of the form that it's processed slightly differently, and that's going to make a difference if we just choose to enable Blazor Server or WebAssembly on the page, which I'll show you what happens. So what I do here is just show some additional checks. So if I check the sausage and peppers, if they're both checked, don't allow it. If they're at Microsoft.com, I also say that this pizza is not available to them either. So this is just another level of validation, and I'll uncomment that so that we know it's going to run. So I'll test that and show you, like, for example, the Microsoft situation. That's not a good email, so that happened first. So I'll just say Tom at, not available to people at Microsoft.com. If I fill everything else in, and change this to something else, we're now good. Peppers and sausage, that doesn't work with that additional validation. So everything's working as expected. Okay, so far so good. However, let me show you something, and I have some strange code in here I'm going to enable just to make the point. Up here, if you see I have this table I generate with just a bunch of numbers. This is just to fill in space on the page. I wanted to make the page longer and have a lot of extra data on it. So let me run that. Now if I go to the form, and you can see I've got all these numbers here, so I could scroll down, and the update button is down here. And if we put in some data and submit the form, watch what happens. Okay, it went to the top of the page, and it did refresh the entire page. It's kind of hard to tell in the video, but it did a full page refresh when that happens, and it jumped up to the top of the page. So Blazor has improved this. They've created what's called enhanced form rendering, and you can enable that by just adding the word enhance on the edit form tag. And what this will do is intercept the form post and post the form in the background and then re-update just the portion of the page that it's relevant to. And this is not doing it using SignalR or doing it with WebAssembly. It's doing it just with a simple mechanism that they've included. So it'll work a little differently now. If I fill in some of this data, scroll to the bottom and hit submit, you can see the page didn't flicker at all, page didn't scroll up at all, but if I scroll to the top, you'll see it did in fact change it and update it. To prove it, I'll do it again. Scroll to the bottom, click, no visual flickering, but if I scroll back up, you can see it did in fact change it. So this enhanced form mode is very useful. It's part of making this application look like a modern application, and I'm glad Microsoft added this functionality to this to really supplement and complement really the server-side rendering mode that we're still in. Now the last point I want to make is you do gain something by enabling one of the other render modes, and to show you this I'm just going to enable server-side rendering for a second. Interactive server. And I'll show you what you gain. It may not be something you care about, but it's something you can get by enabling it. So if I go here now, if I start typing, and I, for example, go here, and then I just kind of click off, notice before I even submitted the form, I got a validation. So this is like real-time validation. Again, that's an interactive feature, so that's something that would require more, connection back to the server in this case, because it's interactive server. Or if this were WebAssembly, that would function as well. So that's the kind of thing that you need to have that enabled for. I click off and boom, last name is too long. Size, medium. But notice actually the not choosing a size didn't trigger that. So that's something that would get triggered. You could adjust that. You could write additional code that would work in Blazor Server or WebAssembly to make that happen. I just didn't do it. The built-in code for, if I choose blank, it doesn't work, you can see. But the built-in code for the attributes handles a lot of that. Now, however, notice this. If I put Microsoft.com, it thinks it's okay. So the way that these attributes work in the interactive server is the attribute checked it and it said it was okay. The custom validation method that I showed you, that second mechanism, does not run automatically in Blazor Server. So that's something you'd have to modify if you wish to do it, or I would suggest actually using the attribute method to do that as well. So that's something you gain using the attributes. So if you want this kind of real-time, click off the inputs and get validation, or you need any more fancy validation, that's when you're going to need to turn on interactive server or interactive WebAssembly. But for many, many forms, this isn't necessary, and you can reduce the footprint of your application, make it much more lightweight and faster and not complicated. So I hope that this video explained the edit form and how it works with server-side rendering in Blazor 8. Please leave a comment if you have any questions, and please subscribe to this video. And thank you again for watching.